If you're new here, I'm Hannah, and I go for a morning walk every morning and bring the camera along and record and talk about a variety of topics. Today, I thought I would share a bit of information about my IVF journey that I went through a number of years ago now. For those of you who are new, I have adopted 2 children from the foster care system in America, where I live. But prior to that, when I was in my late 30s, I embarked on an IVF journey, as many of us do. Sorry, my arm's aching. And I wanted to share my story, because there may be parts of it that resonate with you. Some of you may be going through your own journey, and I think it's good for us ladies to share these stories if we're comfortable doing so. And so here's mine. When I was in my 30s, I got married, and that relationship was not a healthy one, conducive to introducing children into the mix. And so I didn't choose to try and get pregnant during that relationship. And when it ended in my mid-30s, I still believed I had plenty of time to figure out a plan to have kids, to meet somebody else, or whatever that may look like. But when I had my 38th birthday, I had a realization that time was now limited, that turning 40 seemed relatively close. And so I was in the process of moving from America back to the UK. Turn it here. And I decided that once I got back home, I would go and visit a fertility doctor and get kind of my fertility health checked. Once I did this and got the results, I was told that my fertility was in quite poor health. I forget all of the acronyms now, but essentially my follicle count was really low, and the advice from the fertility doctor in the UK was if I wanted to try and get pregnant, then I should move straight to IVF, which is what I did. So, if I haven't mentioned this, or if it's not obvious, I was going through this IVF journey by myself. So I knew going into it that there would be a sperm donor, but I didn't know at the time, I didn't know anyone that had gone through IVF. I didn't know anyone well that I could kind of get the details. So I didn't know what that process looked like in terms of actually choosing a sperm donor. I knew a little bit about the IVF process. So one of the things I did first, before I actually started the IVF part, the medical part, was for the 6 months prior to doing the IVF, I got really healthy, and I used a book called It Starts with the Egg, which I would highly, highly recommend. I actually still refer to this book, even though years later I've kept it, even though I'm not trying to get pregnant. There are a number of chapters in that book that go through different aspects of your health and your environment, and recommendations for you if you are trying to increase your probabilities of getting pregnant and having a healthy pregnancy. And so I would highly recommend that book. I found it really helpful. But I read it and I implemented a number of things, which is why I decided to wait 6 months before actually starting the IVF. So one of them, kind of the most obvious perhaps, is I had a Mediterranean style diet, which I incorporated for those 6 months as I was getting my body and mind ready. I also looked at environmental toxins, BPA. I mean, you can get quite into the weeds with these things. But in a nutshell, I reduced things like perfume, cleaning products that were considered like toxic. What else did I do? The other thing I did was introduce some of the recommended supplements that this book suggested. And the recommended supplements will vary depending on kind of your baseline starting point. So if you're, and this isn't medical advice, but I recommend reading either that book or something else. But if you have PCOS, for example, then recommended supplements may be different from somebody that doesn't have PCOS. So I spent 6 months implementing all of these things, and I can honestly say, to this day, I have never felt so good in my life. And I know that the diet played a role. It's hard to know exactly which elements of that sort of plan that I followed had, the biggest impact, because I introduced everything at the same time. But anyway, I felt like I was giving myself the best chances of increasing the number of eggs that could be retrieved, which for me individually was going to be my challenge for the IVF process. So then I went through one full round of traditional IVF. I selected a sperm donor through, it was actually not through the clinic, that's done separately. But basically you go onto a website, it's for lack of a better phrase, it's a bit like online dating. Like you get all these profiles, different companies provide different levels of detail. So for some you might get a voice sample of the man, and then you get information, sort of biometric information, height, weight, eye color, hair color, nationality, usually like hobbies and interests and things like that. So I'm just going to pause. I think I'm going to turn around, head back this way. Okay. So once I completed that sperm donor process, I provided that information to the IVF clinic, and then the company in the clinic coordinated that aspect of things. So I didn't have to do too much there. So then I went through IVF. So that involved the progesterone and then the injections. And for anyone that hasn't been through IVF, in a nutshell, and this is very much in layman's terms, a doctor would be able to explain this to you much, much better than me. But you basically suppress your cycle for a period of time, and you get regular tests to check your progesterone levels and estrogen levels. And then at the right time that the clinic determine, you then start the injections. So one is to kind of suppress your system until it's at the right point, and then it's to increase your system using the injections to, increase it many more times than it would during a natural cycle. And then when it, again, at the right time determined by the clinic, is when you have the egg retrieval. So I had this done in Oxford in the UK. And the way it was described to me is during the egg retrieval process, you're not fully under general anesthetic. It's a local anesthetic, which made me a bit nervous because it sounded obviously quite unpleasant. But from what I experienced, it was virtually like a general anesthetic. I remember absolutely nothing, felt absolutely nothing until I was essentially woken up. And then, the first thing I asked was, how many eggs did you get? Because like I said, for me, the challenge was going to be the number of eggs they were going to be able to retrieve, and then how many of those eggs were going to be like healthy and viable to put with the sperm to try and implant. And so they were able to retrieve 14 eggs, which was, based on my numbers, was a really healthy amount of eggs. Out of those 14 eggs, they determined that 5 were healthy enough to try and have the sperm implant, and then they monitor those for up to 5 days. The goal is to try and get to 5 days. And out of the 5, at this point, I guess like starter embryos, only 2 were able to get to day 5. And then the clinics have a grading system to basically determine the health and viability of those embryos being implanted into your body. And for the 2 embryos for me, the odds of success were quite low. They advised me, and I, with the doctors, decided to put both embryos, to implant both of them, which is what they did. And then you wait to get the exact number of days. I think it's around 10 days or so, and then you can start taking pregnancy tests. But if you've been through IVF or know anyone that has, you'll understand like how difficult it is to wait the full 10 days. And so it's pretty natural to start, even though you know it's going to be negative, to start taking pregnancy tests before the recommended time. Anyway, so I took pregnancy tests and they came back negative, and that cycle was a failed cycle, and there were no more embryos left to try. So then my options were to try a full round of IVF again, or to look at an alternative option. I decided to go down the route of egg donor, because I knew I had given it everything with that round of IVF with my eggs. I had gotten my body and my eggs in the best shape that I felt like I could. And my gut was just telling me it wasn't worth trying the exact same thing again. And so I started looking into the donor egg route, which has a much higher success rate. And with my doctors, we decided that I would go through a clinic in Barcelona to do a cycle of egg donor IVF. This was also right in the middle of COVID, which presented some complications because there were multiple times I had to go to Barcelona. So how that process looked is I went out to Barcelona. I kind of used it as a weekend away to go to the clinic and get a feel for it and to meet the team there and have them go through all the information with me, and then kind of gave them the go-ahead, and they started the process of matching me with a donor. In Spain, they have advanced technology to where they can, I don't know, through their computer system or whatever the technology is, to match your physical features to the extent that they can with the donors. It's not the same as sperm donor sort of shopping, as it were. I didn't get a catalogue of women where I said, yes, I want the donor to look like that. It wasn't that. I had absolutely no say in who they selected. So there is a bit of sort of blind faith, as it were, that, you know, the professionals know what they're doing. So one of the benefits of donor, egg donor IVF is they can do that IVF process, and then you can kind of schedule when the embryo is implanted. It's slightly less unpredictable. But like I said, we had the complication of COVID in my case. So they let me know once the egg donor had gone through the IVF process and had matched with the sperm donor I had selected. They had 4 healthy embryos. So then the next stage was for me to start on some medications similar to sort of traditional IVF, where they kind of bring your hormone system down to a baseline and then increase it a certain amount to a sort of a trigger point where you have a trigger injection to optimize the time when the embryo is implanted to increase the likelihood of success. So that was the part that was slightly complicated, and it was challenging working with a clinic in another country. Not so much because of the language barrier, because they all spoke excellent English, but just their system was, I had to go to my local clinic to get, you know, progesterone and estrogen tests done, provide the levels to the clinic, and then they would say, let us know the levels and then we'll tell you the next steps. And I wanted to know, well, if it's this, what do we do? And if it's this, what do we do? Because I had to, at some point, you know, jump on a plane and get to Barcelona for the implant. So that was part of the process I didn't really like. I basically had to plan to go to Spain for a week, knowing that sometime during that week it was likely we were going to be doing the implant. And so again, I just looked at it as we're going to have a bit of a holiday, and did it that way. The complication for me was COVID, and so a few days before I was looking at booking flights, it was relatively early on during COVID, and so it was during the UK second wave where a number of the mainland Europe countries imposed a flight ban from the UK. So then I couldn't fly to Barcelona. So I'm going to turn back around. And so what I ended up doing was loading up the car and driving down. Took my dog with me, Alfie, for a bit of a road trip and for emotional support. And we headed down to Spain, and then we did that process. And then again, you're in the waiting period of 7 to 10 days or so until you can start taking pregnancy tests. And then that round of IVF also failed. The statistics for donor egg IVF working in the first sort of 2 or 3 rounds is very high, but it didn't work for the first round. So then I had the 3 embryos left and a decision as to whether to try that again. Around the same time, I had started working in a child protection role in the UK, and this is kind of a whole nother story, but in a nutshell, I decided I wanted to become a foster parent and was also open to adopting from foster care or adoption generally. So when I was going through IVF and I was deciding, when I was 38, like I said, about having children and feeling like if I'm going to make this happen, I'm going to do it by myself, I was already open to options. I wasn't set on getting pregnant myself being kind of the first choice and the only choice for me. And that is different for everybody. And so this video is not intended to pass judgment on anyone about what their preferences are, what their choices are. But just to kind of explain the context that when I was going through IVF, I was also open to not even if it didn't succeed, but regardless, I was open to adoption as well. Around the time the donor egg IVF failed, I had made the decision to move back to America. And that's when I decided to open my home as a foster home in America, and I started that process. And I say this because the way I felt after each of those failed rounds of IVF, I felt physically rubbish. I mean, it is messing with your hormones is just brutal. I just wanted to curl up in a ball, not talk to anybody. I felt really, really crap. But, and I say this because I want to provide some hope and optimism to anyone that's kind of at this point where I was back then. With the IVF failing, I felt like I was also one step closer to having kids. And I know that sounds strange, and now, with the benefit of hindsight, and now I have children, that's easy to say. But that was how I felt at the time. As rubbish as I felt, both physically and mentally, I was like, okay, this perhaps isn't the way that I'm slipping here, that I'm meant to have children. And so now, through kind of eliminating one route, I'm closer to another route succeeding. Ultimately, I did open foster home, and the first 2 children that were separately placed with me in 2023 and then 2024, I adopted this year. So now I have my 1-year-old and my 4-year-old. And my 1-year-old I have had since birth. I still had the 3 embryos in Barcelona. And as part of IVF, you get storage of those embryos for a certain period of time. I believe it's 2 years with the clinic that I used. And as it got to those 2 years expiring, they reached out to me to give me options as to what to do with those embryos. I think the options were to pay another fee for them to store them for an additional period of time, or to have the clinic destroy them, or have the clinic donate them to another woman or family, or to have the clinic use them for their research and development, I think is how it was phrased. So I ultimately decided to donate them for somebody else to use. And that was kind of the end of the IVF part of my journey to motherhood. I'll talk about how I became a foster parent and adopting from foster care probably another time, because this video is getting a bit long. But that is kind of my IVF journey in a nutshell. I don't regret doing it at all, even though it sort of quote unquote failed. It helped me get closer to having my kids. So it was a tough journey, and I think a really lonely journey, even if you have a ton of support. I had really supportive friends at the time, and it was still hard, because unless someone has been through it, it just feels like a bit of a lonely time. I'm going to end this video here. If you have any questions about what I've talked about in this video, or any experience you want to share, go ahead and put those in the comments. I'll read them and get to them on my next time I go walking and I'm talking about this topic. So thanks for joining me if you're still here. I hope there was at least something in this video that was helpful. I do these walks daily, talking about different things, whether that be solo parenting, general life after 40, travel. So feel free to subscribe and join me on the next walk. I'll see you next time.